Hey y'all, this is Brown at IF Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about Arena on Blu-ray. Arena came out in 1989, but it wasn't released in the US until 1991, and it was directed by Peter Manoogian. And Arena was a product of Empire Pictures, which was a low-budget production company that was masterminded by Charles Band with the help of his father, Ahlberg Band. And Charles Band had wanted to become the next Roger Corman, who was in turn the king of the B-movie scene. And so in the 80s, Charles worked with his father Albert to create Empire Pictures, which turned out predominantly exploitation films and always on a low budget. But some of these movies had enough effort put into them, to where they were able to transcend their limitations of their exploitative nature as well as their low budgets to be recognized as legitimately good movies and genuine cult classics. And some of the movies had even been released in the theaters, to where a large audience saw these movies. And so you'd have movies like say Ghoulies and Troll, which in my opinion weren't good movies, but are nonetheless considered staple Empire Pictures films, and are movies that a lot of people saw back in the day when they were released in the theaters. And so on the other hand, though, you'd also have classics like Stuart Gordon's Reanimator and Charles Band's Trancers. And Reanimator in particular is the movie I think that basically brought some mainstream respectability to Empire Pictures, to where it's like, okay, I mean, make no mistake, this is a B-movie production company, but some of these movies were good enough to bring in a mainstream crowd. And Reanimator, in my opinion, was the Citizen Kane of Empire Pictures. And so with Trancers being a close second, I mean, it's, in my opinion, like the second best movie that Empire Pictures did. But it introduced us to the character of Jack Death, played by Tim Thomerson. So there you go. But some movies that came out of the company, unfortunately, were lost in the crowd. And so Arena was, unfortunately, one of those movies. And it's a pity because I actually thought it was a good movie. And my brother and I watched it, and I mean, I'd seen it already, but he hadn't, and he and I were both just having a blast with the movie, and getting immersed in the world building that they had on hand here. And so the world building, I think, kind of isn't that much of a surprise, in the sense that the screenplay for the film was written by Danny Bilson and Paul DeMeo, who had the distinction of writing the screenplays for some of the more highly regarded films to come out of Empire Pictures, namely Trancers, Zone Troopers, and Eliminators, and then this movie. And so, those two screenwriters in particular, I mean, they loved what they did. I mean, when they collaborated together, I mean, you got low budget magic. And so even though the movie that they were working on would be low budget, they would do such a good job of, creating a story that basically drew you in. And so even though there's like, say cheap special effects, there's enough, thought and effort put into, say, fleshing out the characters and fleshing out the world that they inhabit, to where it's like, hey, you can get lost in this movie in a good way, And so Arena, though, was also directed by Peter Manoogian, as I mentioned earlier, but he had the distinction of directing the films Eliminators and Enemy Territory, two films which were considered by many to be, some of the, better films to come out of Empire Pictures. And so Eliminators, which was also written by Denny Bilson and Paul DeMeo, so this wasn't the first time that, the screenwriters and this particular director worked together. Eliminators was actually a good movie. I had the, pleasure of seeing it recently on Blu-ray. It was a double feature with a movie called Dungeon Master, but Eliminators was actually a good movie. On the other hand, Enemy Territory, I can't really say anything about it because I haven't actually seen it. And as far as I can tell, it's not available anywhere for DVD or Blu-ray. And so basically, it's like, I'm guessing licensing issues or maybe film stock issues. I don't know for sure, but I guess if you get a chance and you see Enemy Territory somewhere, check it out because even though I haven't seen it, I've actually heard it's, one of the good films to come out of Empire Pictures. But Eliminators was definitely a good movie, though. So, with that director and those screenwriters working together, I mean, it's no surprise that that Arena was as good of a movie as it was. And so, unfortunately, though, when it came out, it was at a point in time where Empire Pictures was basically undergoing a financial collapse. And so you had several films that were, say, released in that were completed in 1988 or 1989, but not being released until 1990 or 1991. And so, I mean, case in point, you had this movie being one of those films, and you also had Rennie Harlin's Prison, which was one of that particular director's first films, and he's the guy who went on to do films like Die Hard 2 and Cliffhanger and Long Kiss Goodnight. I mean, you had a guy who started off in the B-movie scene, making the transition to the mainstream scene. So, but yeah, Prison, you get a chance, check that movie out. But unfortunately, even though Prison has been reevaluated by modern audiences of the horror scene as a good movie, it unfortunately did not do well at the box office because it was released. It was one of those films that was released when Empire Pictures was collapsing, so it didn't come out until, say, like a year or two later, if I remember correctly, that after it was actually made. So, and you also had the film Robot Jox, which was another Stuart Gordon film, and that was the most expensive movie that Empire Pictures had produced. And it had a budget of somewhere, I think, around $10 million. But unfortunately, it was, I want to say it was made in '89, but it didn't come out until 1990. And so when it was released, it did not do well at the box office. It was a bomb, unfortunately. And so, that was something that, even though it was an Empire Pictures film, another production company took over in producing it. And so Arena was one of those movies in this particular crowd, and it just got lost. And so it wasn't until, several years later that with the advent of Blu-ray, I mean, you had, film companies like Arrow Video, making an effort to, find these movies and, spruce them up and re-release them, with a bunch of special features. And so this is actually a part of a Blu-ray set called Empire of Screams. And so it was basically like Arrow Video was wanting to kind of give, the Blu-ray movie audiences, a bit of a glimpse of what it was like to, go to a video store back in the day and find some of the films that came out of Empire Pictures, because that was where they kind of had the market cornered for a time, was home video. And so Empire Screams, that particular Blu-ray set, had the films Dungeon Master, Dolls, and Cellar Dweller, as well as this film and Robot Jox. And so basically, you had a Blu-ray set that, even though some of the films were better than others, you had a variety of films to choose from. And so no film was exactly the same. Even if, say, one was bad or another one was good or another one was, decent. I mean, you couldn't get bored watching these movies because they're all so different. But each movie, though, has a set of good bonus features. And so Arena, though, I think was definitely a highlight in that particular set, because I would say that next to Dolls, it's one of the legitimately good films in that set. So it's a good film that has some good bonus features. But unfortunately, though, Arena, or at least this particular release of Arena, is exclusive only to the Arrow Video release of the Empire of Scream set. So as far as I know, you can't really get this film as an individual film on Blu-ray. You would have to get that particular movie set. So another downside is that most of the films in that particular set were somewhat spruced up in terms of visual quality. But Arena, though, they weren't able to spruce it up as much as they had wanted to, because there was an issue with tracking down the negatives. And so the only negatives they were able to find were kind of degraded. And so they cleared it up as much as they could. But there are moments where, like, say, when the film opens up, the screen's a little off kilter, or at least what you see on screen is a little off kilter, but then it straightens out, right? But basically that was like the only film stock that they could find for the movie. And so as a result, you have a good movie, but you could definitely tell it's an old movie in terms of, say, how grainy and gritty it looks at times. But make no mistake, this is a good movie. So let's go ahead and get into it. Arena takes place in the year 4038, and the setting is on this space station somewhere out in the galaxy. And there's this well, for lack of a better term, arena that's kind of, say, the life and blood of the space station, because there's this combat sport that's been going on for several years. I mean, we're talking like at least maybe 100 years at one point or another. But it's been going on for a long time. And, basically what you have are, say, two fighters getting into the ring and duking it out with one another. But they'd be, say, aliens from a different race. Like, you have one fighter being from one race, and then you had another fighter being from another race. And so, in order to make it a fair fight, there are these energy beams that are stationed above the arena and basically shining down onto the fighters. And so what ends up happening is the two fighters are basically they're tampered with, I guess you could say, on a physical level, to where somehow the energy beams make it to where the fighters are almost equal in strength. And so that way you could have, say, a smaller, like one of the fighters being smaller, and then you have one of the other fighters being much bigger, but the strength is it was altered enough to where both of them have a fair shot of defeating one another. Like the small guy actually has a chance of taking out the bigger guy, and vice versa. But that's how they try and keep it as close to a fair fight as they can. But one of the fans of this particular sport is a guy named Steve Armstrong, who's played by Paul Satterfield. And Steve is someone who, he's, kind of at a dead-end job. He's working as a short-order cook, but he's got a bit of a skill set when it comes to fighting. It's just that he doesn't really have a chance to demonstrate it a whole lot these days. But he's always had a desire to step in the ring and take a shot at being champion. But no human has fought in the arena for 50 years. And so, basically, it's kind of a pipe dream at this point. But one day, when he's working at his, job as a short order cook, his boss, Shorty, who's played by, give me a sec, Hamilton Camp. Shorty, who's this four-armed alien, humanoid alien, is accosted by some rude customers, and so when one of them tries to pick a fight with Shorty, Steve steps in because Shorty, along with being his boss, is also a friend of his and has kind of kept an eye on him and looked out for him over the years, and so Steve steps in and fights the antagonizer off. And this particular individual is a kind of a fish-like alien, and so Steve basically wipes the floor with him. But in the process, not only do they inadvertently do a lot of damage to the restaurant, but it basically costs both Shorty and Steve their jobs. So basically, Steve finds that he can't, go back to, where he used to live because, there's some sort of credit issue. And as a result of his, violent altercation with, this other individual, regardless of who started it, I mean, basically because he was a part of a fight that resulted in a lot of property damage, basically, he's kicked out of his, own place. But, Shorty, takes him in, to his apartment and, basically gives him a place to, stay for a bit. And because he feels kind of bad about the whole situation because, that fish dude was, coming after him. And, Steve, didn't have to, jump in on his behalf, but he did. And so he's like, hey, at least I could do is, help you out here. And so it also turns out that this particular fish dude that Steve wiped the floor with was one of the arena's fighters. And in particular, he was one of the fighters, for Quinn, who's a fight promoter who's played by Claudia Christian. And so basically, with it's bad enough that now she's out a fighter, but she and her camp are in dire straits because their best fighter next to this fish dude was basically defeated in the arena recently, and he was fighting against this sort of a minotaur-like alien cyborg named Horn, and their fighter was like this multi-armed cyborg who had these spinning attacks, but he was no match for Horn, and was also more than a little over the hill. And so basically, I mean, he tried to put up as good of a fight as he could, but Horn just wiped the floor with him and, more or less, damaged his body in such a way to where he wouldn't be able to fight again. So, Quinn's out two fighters at this point, but there's also the fact that the main fight promoter who's pulling a lot of the strings in the arena is a guy named Rogor, played by Mark Alamo. And Rogor, is a very corrupt individual, and he basically exudes sleaze and corruption, and basically he's willing to have dirty tricks pulled so his fighters can win. And in fact, one of the things that happened in the fight between Horn and Quinn's fighter was he had someone go in and basically dose Horn, with, I'm guessing, some kind of steroids. And so even though Horn was already, beating the crap out of, Quinn's fighter, Rogor, basically wants to make sure that his fighter wins, no matter what, and ethics be damned. And so Quinn, is pretty pissed off at this situation. And so, when she finds out that the person who, beat up her, next best fighter, the fish dude, was a human, I mean, she's more than a little surprised, because even though she's human, there's, as I mentioned, been no human fighter for 50 years. And so she tracks down Steve and Shorty, and basically, makes, Steve an offer, basically, saying, hey, you wiped out my next best fighter, why don't you come, fight for us? We need a fighter. But Steve, though, even though, he's, had this dream of getting into the arena, he's at a point where he's like, that ship's already sailed. And plus, I mean, I just want to, get out of here and, go home, as in, I'm guessing back to Earth. And so, he's like, thanks, but no thanks. And Quinn, she's kind of flabbergasted, because, I mean, she's like, hey, this guy can clearly fight, why doesn't he want to get in the ring? But she's like, okay, right? And so Shorty takes it upon himself to play in some, gambling games, and to get some money, for Steve to be able to get a ticket off the station. And Steve at this point is like, hey, Shorty, dude, you've already helped me enough. I mean, come on, man. But Shorty's like, nope, because apparently his species, values, gratitude and friendship, a lot more than humans do. And so, once, someone, helps one of them out, basically you got a friend for life, right? And so Shorty actually ends up, winning, like losing initially, but then he ends up, getting some good hands and winning a good amount of money. But unfortunately, it's right about then that the casino that they're in is raided by the authorities. And so in the chaos of it all, Shorty, basically, steals, a bunch of money, and, he's telling Steve, hey, come on, let's go. But unfortunately, they're caught by Weasel, who it turns out works for Rogor. And, Weasel forces the two at gunpoint to go with him to Rogor's quarters. And turns out, see, that, Shorty, along with stealing that money, had also stolen some other money that belonged to Rogor, and basically 18,000 credits, I believe was the term. And Shorty had actually used that money to get, a ship, get a, basically, a ticket off of the station, to where he could, get on a ship and, go back to Earth. And so, when Steve, finds out, that's what Shorty, did with the money, and he realizes that they're in trouble, he's like, hey, you want your money back? Here you go. And he gives Rogor the ticket that Shorty bought for him, but Rogor's looking at it, and he's like, this is a non-refundable, one-way ticket. It's no good to me. Plus, it's $13,000. So, where's the rest of it? And, and then Steve's looking at Shorty like, what the hell? What'd you do with, where's the rest of the money? What'd you do? Come on. And so, Shorty's kind of like, I might have sent, the rest of it back home. I mean, come on, I got 24 kids. And so, yeah, his species, apparently, they produce like bugs, right? So, yeah, so Steve's kind of like, what have you gotten me involved in? I mean, why'd you do this for me? I didn't ask you to do this. And so, Rogor is saying that he wants his money, right? And, he's basically, threatening to have Shorty tortured unless he gets his money. And Steve's telling him, hey, look, I got a plan. I'll get you the money. Just give me some time. And Rogor says something like, I'll give you 12 hours. Because apparently he has a bit of a liking for Steve, because Steve kind of stands up for himself and is trying to help his friend out too. And so even though Shorty's the one who got him into the situation, he's trying to do whatever he can to help his friend out. And so Rogor, as corrupt as he is, kind of respects that. And so rather than having Shorty torn apart on the spot and having Steve be next, he basically holds Shorty hostage and gives Steve 12 hours to get the money, which at this point it's a long shot, because I mean most people they're not in a spot where they're able to raise that kind of money, let alone in that short amount of time. But Steve, he makes his way to the quarters of Quinn, and even though it's 3 a.m, she wakes up and she's all like, what the hell is going on? Why are you here? It's 3 a.m. And Steve is like, you still got that spot open? And she's like, yeah. And so he's like, I'm in, but I need such and such amount of money, right? And so basically he needs kind of an advance. And so as it happens, the advance that Quinn gives him is enough to cover the debt. And so in the span of an hour or two, he goes back to Rogor's quarters, where Shorty and Weasel are playing this game of cards. And mind you, Weasel's got Shorty at gunpoint, the whole time. But Steve makes it back to the quarters and gives Rogor the money, the 18,000 that he was demanding. And so Rogor's like, 18,000 credits in less than an hour. I'm impressed. And so he actually makes an offer to Steve, and he makes a point to tell him that basically he can he knows about Steve's desire to get into the ring, and he knows about Steve's fighting abilities. And so he offers him a spot as one of his fighters, but Steve on one hand knows enough about Rogor to know that if he were to get into Rogor's stable, there'd be a lot of corruption going on. And when he gets into a fight, he wants to do so without resorting to cheating or underhanded means. And so he turns Rogor down, but he also tells him that he's already got a manager, Quinn. And so Rogor's like, I mean, he wasn't expecting Steve to have a manager so soon, and let alone someone who he considers beneath him. And so with the debt settled, they let Shorty and Steve go, but they're very skeptical of Steve's chances. They're thinking, this is going to be a joke. Steve's, if he gets in the ring, he's going to be wiped out first round, no problem. But once Steve and Shorty get back to Quinn and her people, they're like, okay, let's do this. And so, Steve starts training, and even though like he hadn't necessarily wanted to get into the ring, because in his mind, his ship is already, come and gone. It's already sailed. And, here he is being forced to fight, because, I mean, he's, made a commitment. But on the other hand, though, there's a part of him that's like, hey, I'm actually getting a chance to, live out my dream here. I mean, I could live out my dream, if I win. And so, in their first fight, in the first fight that Steve has, it's with this, huge, hulking, long-tailed alien called Sloth. And, let's just say it's a good thing that the arena had those energy beams shining down, aiming at them, and basically altering their strength to where it's equal, because otherwise Sloth probably will wipe the floor with Steve. But so when the fight happens, Sloth is initially winning, because of his the fact that he's frankly much bigger than Steve, and Steve is much smaller. But eventually, though, Steve actually turns the tide and wins. And so it's basically like a 3-round fight. And, Steve wins 2 of the rounds by getting Sloth out of the arena. And, basically that's one of the, conditions of victory. One fighter knocks the other out of the arena, and that's, a fight that they win. And so, no one was expecting Steve to win. And part of it was because Shorty and Quinn, were, basically, training him and, telling him, where, certain, nerve clusters were on Sloth's body. And so even though, Sloth, definitely had the advantage in, size and strength, Steve was nimble enough to, once he, found his rhythm, he was able to, hit Sloth's weak spots and make him vulnerable, and basically maneuver him to where he was able to knock him out of the ring. And so it's kind of an upset victory, but here he is, the first human in 50 years to fight in the arena, and he won against this monstrous opponent. And so Rogor and Weasel, they're watching from their side of things, and they're both kind of like, it's luck. It has to be luck, but sure enough, Steve, working, under, Quinn's management, as well as, having, Shorty, be his corner man, he ends up, advancing through, all these victories, and, making it to where, he has a shot at the championship. And so at this point, you got people who were in a lower economic class, rooting for him because, Steve kind of came from a, lower class background. And so here he is kind of giving hope to the masses, and, basically, bringing Quinn and Shorty a lot of money at the same time, as well as, for himself too. But at the same time, I mean, here he is, this, unlikely contender for champion, and no one had ever expected, a human to be able to pull this off. And so, as the time approaches for this championship fight, which is going to be against, Horn, the fighter that basically, wiped the floor with, Quinn's, previous fighter at the beginning of the movie. When it's getting to this point, Rogor and Weasel basically are kind of like, okay, we need to do something here, because a lot of people that were betting on this fight are losing money because Steve's winning when they're all thinking he's going to lose. And so and he's also winning the crowd. And so Rogor's kind of like, hey, it's okay, I got this under control, when he really doesn't. And so what he ends up doing is having his consort, a woman named, let's see, Jade, who's played by Sherry Shattuck. And Jade is a singer who has some celebrity status on the station, and Steve had actually met her one night at a casino, and at a game table, and the two of them have seen each other here and there in between that particular night and this approaching fight. And so there's definitely an attraction there. And Jade, even though she's Rogor's consort, develops a liking for Steve, but when Rogor instructs her to seduce him and poison him, that's where she kind of has her loyalties tested, because she's really come to like Steve, but she's Rogor's girl, and she works for him, right? And so she reluctantly does so, and as a result, Steve is, you know, nearly killed because of the poison, and but fortunately, medical personnel are able to get to him in time to where they're able to get the poison out of his system. But once that happens, though, Rogor, once he learns that Steve is actually going to be fighting his champion Horn, he's like, Weasel, do what you gotta do. And so Weasel and a compatriot of his called Skull, who's this weird, humanoid creature that has all these wires sticking out of her head or its head. The two of them basically, make plans to sabotage the energy beams that are manipulating the strength of the fighters, to where it's like an even fight. And so when that happens, well, Steve's going to have his metal tested like never before. And so that's basically the gist of the movie right there. And it's a movie that it's actually pretty short. Like most of it's 97 minutes long. A lot of movies that came out of Empire Pictures, they were either an hour or a little over an hour. Very seldom was it, like 2 hours. And so, a lot of stuff happens in the movie, but it's kind of at a fast pace. But at the same time, I think that, the movie, gets its story across and does what it set out to do, which is basically to have, Rocky in space almost. But ironically, it's, behind the scenes, it wasn't supposed to be Rocky in space because on the commentary track, as well as on one of the interviews on the special features, you find out that Danny Bilson and Paul DeMille had wanted to do kind of a sci-fi parody version of this old black and white boxing movie called Body and Soul, which came out in 1947. And so, the screenplay that they had, turned in originally was more along the lines of, a sci-fi parody of that movie. But, some other people did some rewrites on the script. And so what ended up happening was, you had a movie that, in the opinion of one of the screenwriters, wasn't able to find an even tone, because on one hand, there are moments where it takes itself very seriously, but then on the other hand, you get an idea of the original type of comedy that Danny Bilson and Paul DeMille were going for. But had I not, listened to the commentary track, or had I not, watched the interview, I think I wouldn't have been able to tell, because, personally, I thought it was a good movie. I thought that, the writing was good, the acting was good, the world building was very impressive, for a low budget, because, you have for example, you have, like, old school, practical effects when it comes to like the makeup and, the aliens that you see, or, the monster creations that are on hand. You have people like John Carl Buechler and Steve Wang and Screaming Mad George doing a lot of the makeup and effects work. And so you have, despite a low budget, a lot of characters that look fantastic. They genuinely look like aliens. And so, they put a lot of effort into, giving us a world that, we could get lost in the best way possible. And also the production design was really well done too, because the space station, the settings they had for a space station, like the interiors, they looked very lived in. Like some parts of the station were clean, but then as you got to the lower parts, it looked more and more dirty, for lack of a better term. And so watching this particular movie, I'm wondering if the people who did Babylon 5 weren't in some way inspired by this movie, which, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, considering that, you had Claudia Christian playing one of the main characters in this movie, and she also went on to play Susan Ivanova on that particular show. So, and then again, you also had Paul Alimo, I think is how you say his name. Sorry, Mark Alimo, as Rogor. He had the distinction of playing Gul Dukat on Star Trek Deep Space Nine. And so, the type of character he plays here is in some ways, similar to, the war criminal, Gul Dukat on Deep Space Nine, but except in this case, instead of being a war criminal in this movie, he's a corrupt, fight promoter, but nonetheless, that, aurora of evil, or that aura of evil that, he exudes here, I'm sure had something to do with him getting the gig on Deep Space Nine. I mean, or, if it didn't, I'd be surprised, because there's a very much a similarity between characters, but yeah, so you have a movie that, if you've seen Deep Space Nine or Babylon 5, this movie probably had some influence on the world building in those particular TV shows in terms of, say, production design and what have you, because here in Arena, I mean, you have a space station that, on one hand, on for the exterior shots, you have like a model that's being used for the space station, as well as for some of the spaceships that you see in the opening scene, which are very well put together. And so, I mean, you have this. Even though the whole movie more or less takes place on the space station, you're given enough of a glimpse of the outside world that there's like a whole galaxy to play with, and there's so many stories to be told. It's just the focus of the movie is on one story, right? And so as far as, say, like the characters, I thought that they were well written and well acted. And I think that the main cast did a good job. Paul Satterfield, who plays our main hero, Steve, I haven't actually seen him in anything, I don't think. If I did, I wouldn't be able to tell you, but I actually thought he was pretty good here. He, as a lot of people would have said in, reviews about the movie, he has an uncanny resemblance to Christopher Reeve, except he's blonde and Christopher Reeve has dark hair, but no, he looks, he has that kind of physique, and so he definitely has what it takes to pull off the fighting moves in the movie, and he's definitely got some good physical chops to pull it off. And so when you're watching him in the movie and going up against these alien fighters, I mean, you're at no point does it look fake. It looks like he's actually fighting these guys, and so it's kind of I guess you could say a good bit of physical acting on his part, and some good some good fight choreography and what have you, but while you're not going to mistake his performance for an award-winning one, I mean, he does a good enough job to where you not only buy him as a fighter, but you also buy him as a heroic protagonist, in a sense that he he's trying to help his friend out, and also pay off basically pay his debt to the people that he owes something to. And in this case, I mean, he could have had, a cushy, fighting career under Rogor, but at the same time, he has standards. If he gets into a fight, he wants it to be a fair fight. Like, granted, I mean, make no mistake, he's going to try and win that fight, but he's not going to do it through underhanded means. And so, and he also gave his word to Quinn that he'd be her fighter, and he didn't want to take the money and run. So he has some morals, and so that was pretty cool to see. And I liked his rapport with Shorty, And I think just that, Paul Satterfield, like I said, it's not an award-winning performance by any means, but he does well enough to where, he's a likable character, or Steve is a likable character, and you're definitely, rooting for him to win. And so even though, this movie is kind of like Rocky in space, and you have an idea that, yeah, he is going to come out on top, there is enough tension in the movie at times, and there's enough upsets, for him to where you're like, okay, yes, there's definitely, some risk involved here. There's an element of danger here, as the movie gets into its third act. And so I did appreciate that. And I liked how, some, lesser people, like a lesser director or lesser, writers, might have had to where, he's like mighty whitey and just, walking through, these alien fighters, no problem, right? But no, they make a point to show that, hey, I mean, this is, this is a guy who's, trying to find his feet. He's trying to, find his sea legs, so to speak. And to where, like, I mean, having a brawl in a restaurant's one thing, but, trying to get to where, he's comfortable in the arena. I mean, you see him get to that point, and, it's a neat process to see. And, when even though he wins the fight with, that monstrosity Sloth, his first opponent, you can tell that, it's not an easy fight for him. And it's, basically him trying to get into the rhythm of things. And so I did appreciate seeing that. And so, and especially there are moments where he's kind of his own worst enemy. Like, he gets impatient at times, basically pursues, someone that, he has romantic feelings for that he probably shouldn't have those feelings for. And sure enough, she's in, that particular, character, Jade. I mean, sure enough, I mean, yeah, she's, starting to like him too, but she's in Rogor's pocket all the way. So, yeah, I mean, this is a character that, I mean, even though this is kind of the equivalent of Rocky in space, there are some flaws with this character that make him, kind of fleshed out. And so we basically, by, Paul Satterfield's, performance, as, Steve, as this, aspiring fighter. And so, when he's succeeding and when he's getting to a point where he has a shot at the championship, it's cool to see. But at the same time, it's not like a flawless, victory type of situation. It's, there are some struggles he has to, go through, like whether it be, him getting out of his own way, or, trying to, find the rhythm of, fighting in the arena. I mean, it's a pretty good performance, and as a result, Steve is a likable character, or is a likable protagonist. But the scene stealer, though, is Hamilton Camp as Shorty. And so Hamilton Camp is one of those actors that I know I've seen him in something, but I wouldn't be able to tell you what. It's like a long time ago. But, he, has a sort of, type of voice. And he has this sort of almost like a grizzled, borderline playful demeanor. But at the same time, like seeing him like play this humanoid character, but nonetheless, I mean, it's made very clear that he's an alien through like the fact that he has 4 arms, and also through lines of dialogue, such as, the throwaway line of, oh yeah, I've got 24 kids, because apparently his species, breed like crazy, and they have, a different set of values as far as friendship goes. And so like little lines of dialogue go a long way towards world building, especially with, his, character and his species. But Shorty, though, was basically, the corner man to top all corner mans, because, I mean, he's looking out for Steve. He's, but I mean, and granted, he makes his money on, whatever money he can on his side. But at the end of the day, though, he's, got Steve's back, and, he's, giving him some good advice, basically, doing whatever he can to help him. And, his rapport with, Steve, is, pretty good. It's like a lot of it's, kind of, played for comedy, but there's also like a genuine sense of almost family, because he's kind of like a surrogate father figure for, Steve in some ways. And I just thought that, Hamilton Camp did a really good job in the part. And there's even a moment or two where you actually get to see him, fight, other, not in the arena, mind you, but, fight some, hoodlums, from, say, Rogor or something like that. And so it's kind of like, you kind of underestimate him, because you're thinking that, yeah, he's a likable character and he's stealing the show, with his lines and everything, but you're thinking that, oh, this is a guy who can't defend himself. Well, no, he can. So on the occasions that, it's on one hand, it's pretty cool to see him in the casino and, doing his thing there, because this guy's like a shark, right? When it comes to, the games and everything. But then when you have moments where you see that he can, hold his own in a fight, and specifically in the third act, it's kind of like, damn, that's, didn't see that coming. So yeah, that was kind of a nice surprise. And so all around, Shorty, is, while Steve's the main character, Shorty's the one that you go away remembering the most, I think, simply because of, the energy that Hamilton Camp, brings to the table. And you have this, sort of, much like, the character Steve, he's not without his flaws. He takes money that he probably shouldn't be taking from certain people, and, takes liberties with it, such as, when he, he spent most of it on, Paul's, ticket off the station, but then, sent the rest of it back home, and so it's kind of like, it's bad enough you swipe money that you shouldn't have, swiped, but, you're going too many different directions with it, man. And so, yeah, like there is an element of, Shorty, kind of being his own worst enemy as well, much like Steve. And so I think in that sense, there was a similarity with the two characters. Like, they're very different personalities, but in some ways they're both their own worst enemies. And so, but, much like the character of Steve, we end up liking, Shorty, and we get invested in his character. And, we're hoping that, yeah, your crazy schemes aside, you come out okay. And so, and then we got Claudia Christian as Quinn. And one of the things I respect about Claudia Christian is that even when she's in a B movie, she turns in a good performance. Like, she takes her work seriously. And, watching her here, it was kind of like, Ghost of Things to Come with her role in Babylon 5, because, a lesser, director might have just had her as eye candy, because, she's very beautiful in this movie. But no, there is a sense of, authority with her that she's able to pull off. And, basically, we buy her as a fight promoter. And, granted, that doesn't mean, she's, a witch with a bee or anything like that. And she's not like an ice queen or anything. But like, there is a sense of warmth with her. Like she's in a business, to be sure, but at the same time, she actually does care about her fighters. And so, that's why it's like, when I guess you could say, the referee or the committee or what have you are clearly under the thumb of Rogor, it's, very frustrating for her, because here she is, trying to, have a fair fight, for her fighter. But when, you got someone, constantly, stacking the deck against you unethically, it's something that, takes a toll, and you can see her mounting frustration with the situation. And so, when she's got, Steve to fight for her, you definitely see, her demeanor actually soften in some ways to a point where it's like, hey, there's some hope here, because, no one thought that Steve would go as far as he did. But, so it's really cool, seeing her, go from, um, professional and professional, yet not without, some warmth to, hey, she not only is she Steve's trainer, but she becomes his friend too. And so it's really cool to, see her go from point A to point B. And you really do, see her, demeanor, gradually, change, throughout the movie. And I thought that Claudia Christian did a good job in the part. And once again, shades of things to come, with, her part in Babylon 5. So there you go. But yeah, I just think it's cool that, even though this is a B movie, and this wasn't going to win any Academy Awards, she still came in and did a wonderful job with her character and gave a, believable performance. And so, and Mark Alemo as Rogor, he was really good as the villain. Basically a very ruthless individual, and you definitely, see the aforementioned similarities to Gul Dukat if you watch Deep Space Nine, but, it's like for a different character though. And, this is someone that, I mean, he's not above, potentially having someone killed, so this is not someone that, this is more than just your, sleazy, fight promoter. This is someone who's a genuine criminal, who's pulling the strings and running the show. And Mark Alemo, he's always had this, memorable, glare, or this intense look in his eyes, whenever he's focusing on someone. And it's like he's, watching, you like a hawk. And so whenever, he's talking to someone in the movie, it's like he's sizing them up in one way or another. And it's like everyone's a pawn, for him that can, be used and discarded at his whim. And there is definitely a sense of an element of very believable danger that comes from his character. And so I like it when, characters, they're clearly villains, but they're not just like, mustache twirling villain. Like there's a sense of control that they have, and they don't have to, rave and rant. Like there's like a very measured tone that they have, in their actions and their mannerisms and everything. And Mark Alemo did, a wonderful job, I thought, in the part. And it's definitely a good villain, and you want him to get his comeuppance. And then you had Sherry Shattuck as the singer Jade, and I thought she did a good part. She did a good job in the part that she had. She didn't have, like, it was an important part, but it wasn't, say, like, whereas, the characters of Steve and Shorty and, Quinn, get a lot of attention. Jade didn't get as much as they did, and so I would have liked to have seen more of her character and, say, her dynamics with, Rogor. And, because it's touched upon in a sense that, it's made clear that she's his consort and in his pocket, but she does a good enough, Sherry Shattuck does a good enough job in the part to where, you do see that sort of conflict, brewing in her head, because, her character genuinely does, come to, care for Steve, but at the same time, excuse me, she's too far in the pocket of Rogor to, basically, shuck it off and, say heck with it, and so so it was interesting seeing her in that sense, like that sort of, like she doesn't want to, do something to hurt Steve, but at the same time, she's going to do it, that kind of thing. But you do see that there is some regret there on her part. Like she, some, other movies have a similar situation to where, such a character would just be an ice queen and, very cold about everything. And, it's like basically, stab you in the back and, go out for tea afterwards. But I mean, Jade doesn't come across as that kind of character. Like, yeah, she's, I guess, technically a villain in this sense, but she's not without remorse, though. And it was interesting seeing, you know, that part kind of brought out here and there. Like, there's not a lot of time devoted to that aspect, of her character, because, her character doesn't have, like, it's an important part, but it's not like, she doesn't have, like, say, the lion's share of, the action as, say, Steve and Shorty and Quinn, right? But at the same time, though, I mean, Jade, I mean, as played by, Shari Shaduk, I mean, she's a very, beautiful, woman. She's very beautiful to look at. And there's even like some good physical acting on her part, whether it be like seducing Steve, or, singing at a nightclub lounge. And one of the interesting things about that particular scene was that, it looks like she's actually singing, but it's lip syncing though. It's like someone else was, doing the singing, behind the scenes. But, physically though, she was able to pull it off to where it looked like she was actually singing. So, so she actually did some good physical acting as well. And then, you also had Armin Shimmerman, I hope I'm saying his name right, as Weasel. And you watch the movie and you hear his voice, you're like, that's Quark from Deep Space Nine, the Ferengi bartender. Yeah, so, it was like, hey, now he's like, before he was the Ferengi bartender on Deep Space Nine, he was this, well, weasel-like alien who was more than a little, bloodthirsty. And definitely got his kicks, when it came to, say, hurting or killing someone. Because he makes it very clear that he's hoping that Steve wasn't able to come up with the money when he's holding Shorty hostage, because he's looking forward to cutting off his fingers and gradually sending them to Steve one by one. And mind you, Shorty's got 4 hands, so that's a lot of fingers. So yeah, Armin Shimmerman does a good job of playing up this laughably bloodthirsty and sadistic character that literally looks like a weasel. And it's a really good makeup and costuming job on the part of the effects people that put his character together. And so basically, I mean, there's no CGI or anything. It's like makeup, costuming, and you have this alien character that looks alien, and kind of at times a laughably evil character. But when you see just how far he's willing to go, you're kind of like, okay, yeah, this guy is actually pretty dangerous. And so he does a good job as playing the underling for Rogor. And you see the villainous rapport that the two of them have, like they're kind of two peas in a pod. Whereas, but on the other hand, you see that Rogor's the more subtle one, whereas Weasel's the more, I guess you could say, excitable one. And so it's like two different types of villainy there, but both dangerous in different ways. And I thought that, Weasel was a good depiction of the other side of the coin, whereas Rogor was calm and calculated. Weasel was all basically in your face, and couldn't wait to hurt or kill someone. So yeah, I mean, Armin Shimmerman I thought did a good job in the part, because I mean, he on one hand he has some funny lines for sure, but at the same time, there is definitely an element of danger and threat. His character is a threat, to be sure. So, so I thought that this was definitely an instance where the movie did a good job of balancing between fun and games to there's a real element of danger here. Like there's like something could go wrong, that kind of thing. But you also had Michael Deke as Horn, the sort of cyborg minotaur looking champion that is fighting for Rogor. And the makeup and costuming on his character is amazing. I mean, we're talking like full on practical effects, and the like animatronic stuff, like when you see the mouth moving and the eyes blinking and everything, it's kind of like, that's pretty well, very well done. And once again, when you have people like John Carl Buechler, Steve Wang, and Screaming Mad George at the helm, it's no surprise that characters like Horn look as good as they do. And now a lot of the acting on Michael Deak's part was physical, because he actually played, several of the alien characters, like several of the alien fighters that we see, just in it's like different costumes, but the same guy, right? But, Michael Deak, though, he was a very tall, guy in real life, and in several other Empire, Pictures films, he would play a monster of some sort. And so it was pretty cool, actually, getting to see him, have some time in the limelight, because while he is in costume as more than one character, when he's playing Horn, I mean, you definitely get to see how good of a physical actor he is. And, once again, the, makeup and effects people do a good job of, making it to where, Horn looks, like a genuine, alien, creation, and a genuine alien fighter. And so it's a good character and a good physical performance by Michael Deak. And then like those were definitely the highlights, I think, as far as the performances go. And so everyone that has a part to play here, I thought, did a really good job. And to where it's like, even though on the downside the movie is predictable, the characters are written well enough and played well enough to where we're invested, and we care about what happens to Steve and Shorty, and we hope that they're able to on one hand survive any sort of assassination attempts that Rogo or Weasel might have for them, but on the other hand, we're also in Steve's corner, hoping that we know he's a good fighter, but we're hoping that he's able to beat the odds and become a champion. And so that's something that, even though the movie's predictable in the sense that it's like Rocky in outer space, I mean, I do appreciate the fact that especially in the third act, you do have the stakes being raised. And so when Steve and Horn are fighting each other, I mean, even though you have an idea of who's going to win at the end of the day, I mean, they don't make it easy. I mean, in the sense that it genuinely looks like Steve and Horn are being put through the ringer. Like there's sweat, there's blood. I mean, not an all-out gore fest, but they look like they're fighting. And so I appreciated that. So even though the movie is predictable in the sense that you have a pretty good idea of how it's going to end, and whether or not the hero is going to come out on top, you do see that the hero has to work for it, physically speaking. And so and that's something that I did appreciate, is like the people that were playing the fighters, whether it's playing ordinary human Steve, or Michael Deak in one costume or another. I mean, the fights are done well enough to where like they look real, or as real as a low budget movie could look, but they look there's definitely some gravity to the fights, in a sense that there's blood and sweat on hand, and sometimes that goes a long way to softening the damage of a movie being predictable. But I guess if there was another thing, one of the downsides of the movie is that there's so much lore that's hinted at, so basically, I mean, all the focus is on the main story of the movie, but Danny Bilson and Paul DeMeo were such good writers, that they're able to give you, a glimpse or a hint of a bigger world, outside of, what the main movie's, showing you, through lines of dialogue. And so, and that's on hand here in Arena. So, I mean, even though, someone else, came in and, rewrote a good portion of the screenplay, that characteristic of their writing is still on hand here. And so, even though the main, even though the majority of the movie takes place on the space station, I mean, we know that there's a whole galaxy out there, with other characters. I mean, because it's like in here, it's a microcosm of the galaxy's alien and human residents. And that was something that I thought was pretty cool, because once again, you have something that if you've seen Deep Space Nine and Babylon 5, you're thinking, okay, someone from those shows behind from the production had to have seen this movie, because they do a good job of focusing on certain characters, being the main characters, but at the same time, they show you enough of the world around them, in a sense that you see all these, alien, characters in the background. And it's not like cheap looking, makeup or anything like this is, even though like it's a low budget, the makeup and stuff looks really good. And, the alien characters we do see, look very, unique and distinguishable from one another. And so I love it when you have world building like that, whether it be through visuals of, say, costuming and production design, or lines of dialogue, giving you a glimpse of a world outside of the main setting. But okay, so the downside though is that with the runtime of 97 minutes, the movie's pretty short. And so while it's good in a sense that the main story it flows at a good pace, the glimpses that we get through lines of dialogue, or through say seeing some of these alien characters in the background, the glimpses that we get are fascinating in their own way. And so while the story itself is pretty good, and we're invested in the main characters, at least in my case, I was wanting to see more of the world outside of the main story. Like I was wanting to see who was flying the other spaceships that you see at the beginning of the movie. I was wanting to get to know some of the alien characters that we see interacting with the main characters. And I mean, and even like the human characters, like say at one point there's Shorty introduces Steve to the former human champion from 50 years ago. It turns out that he's still on the station, but he's in the lower decks and falling on hard times. And I mean, it's it's a cool scene and everything, because you see it, there's a history there. But it would have been nice if we would have gotten maybe a scene or two where Steve and this former champion had some one-on-one time, to where maybe because Steve is Steve is finally getting to live his dream, and here he is filling the shoes of a one-time champion. That I would have liked to have seen some scenes between them where this former champion got to tell Steve what it was like back in the day, or just give him some life perspective as a former champion and fighter. But even though he can't fight anymore, it would have been cool to see him offer something to Steve for, say, learning experience and what have you. And also just one of the casualties of the shortened runtime, I think, was the character of Jade, because while While Shari Shatuk does a good job in the part as Jade, um, as I mentioned, like there's not a lot of time devoted to her character, and so she's a good enough actress to where, we buy the fact that she's, got a conflict going in her head between, being, loyal to Rogor, but actually coming to care for Steve. It's kind of rushed in that regard. It's like, I mean, she's a very attractive woman, and we see why Steve's kind of smitten with her, but the way the movie has the two of them get together, it feels very abrupt and rushed. And I think a lot of that was because of the shortened runtime. I think if maybe there'd been a scene or two more of them getting to know each other, I think that maybe the two of them eventually getting together, wouldn't have been, wouldn't have come across as so abrupt. And so, so yeah, it's like, the shortened runtime, I think sort of works against the movie, as does the fact that it is predictable. But even though, the movie has those two problems, there's enough, effort being put into the movie to where, we can kind of accept it. It's like, those flaws are there, but, the actors are good enough in their parts, to where, we're invested in their characters. And, the people who put this movie together, the people who designed the space station, the people who did the makeup and costuming on these wonderful looking alien characters, whether they're fighters or background characters. I mean, there's so much effort being put in to bring these characters to life, that it's kind of like you want to go along for the ride, and it's a good ride. And I will say another thing was the score by Richard Band. And Richard Band was a brother of Charles Band, and he did a lot of music for several, Empire Pictures films. But here, though, I'm more used to him doing, scores for horror films. So, hearing him do a score for a science fiction film was actually a nice change of pace, because it's I'm sorry, I'm not a music major or anything like that, but it's like the tone of the music, it's just right. It's from an audio standpoint, you feel like you're being pulled into another world, and something that's hopeful and optimistic, as far as this is a whole new adventure we're going on here. And when the fights are going on, the music gets intense at times, but not to a point where it overwhelms everything, but just enough to where it's like, not only are we kind of invested in doing the equivalent of chowing down on the popcorn because the fights are so good, but the music definitely helps out as well. And so Richard Band, he does a good job of having an appropriate sense of how to do the music for the scenes on hand, whether they're soft and intimate scenes or between characters, or something funny, or basically showing you like a whole new world. I mean, Richard Band does a good job in conveying that through music. So see, I'm trying to think if there's anything else, but so yeah, that was Arena. I'm gonna go ahead and give Arena 4 out of 5 stars. Arena was a good movie, and I think it's a bummer that it's one of the movies that was caught up in that was one of the victims of the collapse of Empire Pictures. And by the time it was released in the United States, it didn't really have a wide release. And so over time, though, I think it's begun to find its audience, because with this Blu-ray here, and a lot of people using Blu-ray these days. I don't know about if it's on streaming, but the Blu-ray here, I think definitely introduced this movie to a lot of you know people in this new generation, and the audience is definitely building up for the movie. If you look online, there's all sorts of reviews for the movie, and a lot of them are fairly favorable. So that's nice to see. And I just think that maybe if the movie had come out earlier than it did, I think it would have done better. Because maybe at that, if say things were different and it came out before Empire Pictures had their collapse, I mean, who knows? I mean, it might have been another success as far as say, maybe if not outright matching Reanimator in terms of how successful it was, at the very least being a genuine hit for Empire Pictures, and maybe extending the production's company's longevity as an entity, but unfortunately it didn't work out that way, and as a result you had a good movie that didn't do well when it came out at the time, but as time has gone on, it started to find its audience, I think. And this particular Blu-ray from the Empire of Scream set from Arrow Video, I thought did a wonderful job of sort of recapturing that sort of home video aesthetic that a lot of the Empire Pictures movies had, but also with the good amount of bonus features, allowing us to learn about the behind the scenes stuff. So as far as special features go, you have, let's see, you have subtitles, which sometimes come in handy because it is an older film, and a lot of the dialogue I could hear fine, but some of it, at times it was like, the background noise in the movie was louder than the dialogue being spoken by the characters, so subtitles definitely help. But you also have a really good audio commentary track with director Peter Manoogian and film critics Maddie Brudericks and David Wayne. And those two film critics are also on the commentaries for the other movies in this particular Blu-ray set, the Empire of Scream set. And so I've actually listened to the commentary tracks for all those movies, including this one. And so it's pretty cool seeing how consistent they are in terms of, say, how they talk about things. And so even though they're talking about different movies, there is a sense of consistency. But here, though, you could tell, they're having a blast watching the movie, and like how they were genuine fans of the movie. And when they're talking to Peter Manoogian, they don't just talk about the movie. Like Peter Manoogian, he tells them how he got started in film, and how he actually started out working for Roger Corman, and then going from Roger Corman to Charles Band, and he talks about some of his other film work and everything. But when they're focusing on the movie, though, he has some good stuff to say, and you find out some behind-the-scenes stuff, and there are some things that he's like, I wish I'd done such and such differently, or hey, I liked how this turned out, or hey, that's how we did such and such. So all in all, though, I mean, it's a good commentary track, and it's a good listen. It's fun, and it's informative. So there you go. And you also have, let's see, Not His Arena, an interview with Danny Bilson, who was the co-writer of this movie with Paul DeMeo. And basically, this was a good interview, but it was kind of bittersweet, at least in my opinion, because I genuinely thought this was a good movie, and I thought that it was a good story, and it was well written as far as low-budget sci-fi films go. But Danny Bilson, though, does not have any nostalgia for this movie whatsoever. And when you hear why, you can kind of understand it in the sense that, as I mentioned earlier, he and Paul DeMeo were originally wanting to do kind of a sci-fi parody of the old boxing movie Body and Soul, but then whoever it was that came in and did the rewrites, basically pushed it into more along the lines of Rocky in outer space, which was something that it was very predictable, both as a concept and as I mentioned, as a film too, because as much as I like the movie, that is one of the downsides. The Rocky and Outer Space thing, you know how the movie's going to turn out with the main character. So, but yeah, but the Danny Bilson though, when he's talking about it, he doesn't just talk about this movie in particular. He talks about how he and Paul DeMeo got started at Empire Pictures, and he talks about some of his own experiences as well. And listening to him, you get this conflicted, depiction of, what it must have been like to work for Charles Band and Empire Pictures. Because on one hand, like a lot of the people they worked for, like Charles Band, were genuinely nice guys, according to him. But, it's just when it came to, say, promoting certain work, or having, money delivered on time to, to certain personnel behind the scenes, that's where some of the problems lie. Because, he was talking about how when he was working on Zone Troopers, it was like his first time directing something, and and so he's already under a lot of pressure. But he's talking about how there was a time where they didn't get the money on time, and so the Italian film crew was like, "We're not working until we get the money." So Charles Band literally had to come in with like bags of cash, and whereas if he had just been professional about things, they probably wouldn't have had that problem, So, so you get an idea that, when Danny Bilson was working at Empire Pictures, I mean, you had a bunch of people that wanted to make movies and were passionate about what they're doing. It's just that the business, practices, weren't as, I guess, weren't as professional as they could have been. And had they been more professional, I get the idea that Empire Pictures might have lasted longer and had a better end, as opposed to the financial crash out that it had. But as far as this particular movie goes, the way he talks about how it came to be was much like, some of the film ideas for the Cannon Group. Some of the film ideas from Empire Pictures, came from, say, just a picture, a painting. And in this case, Danny Bilson and Paul DeMeo were shown this really cool painting, this sort of sci-fi painting of, two fighters in an arena, one human, sort of, futuristic looking, boxing, gear and everything, going up against this, sort of shark looking, character. And so basically they were told, okay, make a story for this movie, give this movie a name. And so, they're like, okay. And so the two of them eventually cranked out a story for the movie, and they got the name for the movie. And, Arena, eventually, they went through several other names, but eventually they came up with Arena. And, they were wanting to, as I mentioned earlier, they were wanting to do that sci-fi parody of Body and Soul. And one of the things that they like to do was go through, dictionaries and, look up, old slang from the 1930s or 40s. And so, and it's apparently that was something they did when they were working on Trancers. And so you have some distinctive lines of dialogue that sounds like, it's very retro in a futuristic or modern day setting. And so there's a little bit of that on hand here, but probably because the script was rewritten to some extent, I could see where it's different from their other films that they wrote together, whereas like they had more creative control. So I guess in hindsight, like, watching the movie the first time, I wouldn't have been able to tell that, the script was partially rewritten by someone else. But at the same time, after having, listened to the interview that Danny Bilson gave, you can kind of see some differences, in terms of, say, the type of stuff they would usually write or how they would usually write something versus how this movie came out. And so, he concludes with basically saying that, he understands that, I mean, he's glad the movie has found an audience, but, it's not a movie that he wants to revisit anytime soon, because he's like, as a writer, you always have, the perfect movie in your head. And so even if it's a good movie, once it actually comes out on screen, you're constantly picking it apart, And so now imagine that, it's not even your movie anymore and it's on screen. And they're saying it comes from you, but it doesn't come from you. I mean, so he's kind of pissed off about it, but he's like, I might watch it one day, because he's got several movies that he and Paul DeMeo had worked on over the years, and some of them were movies that were like, yeah, you could tell we definitely, wrote those. But on the other hand, there were some movies that he's like, yeah, we wrote them, but then they were rewritten by someone else. And so he's like, he tried watching one of those movies one time, and he's like, I couldn't finish it. So, but he's saying like he might watch Arena one day. So it was a good interview, I thought, and it was a good listen. And he seems like a pretty cool dude. You get a lot of insight into, how his career went and what it was like, working for Empire Pictures back in the day. And it's a bummer that, he didn't like the movie as it came out. And I can understand his, bitterness in terms of, say, the script being mostly rewritten by someone else. But it's actually a good movie, and regardless of that. So, but let's see. Give me a sec. Ooh, okay. Empire of Monsters. And it's an interview with the special makeup effects artist Michael Deek. And Michael Deek, as I mentioned earlier, was this really tall actor who was known for playing a lot of monsters in Empire Pictures movies. And he played multiple alien characters in Arena. And so, he was interviewed on one of the other movies for one of the special features. And so it was pretty cool to see him here again. And this is a guy who, he loved what he was doing. And, he talks about what it was like undergoing different processes of, makeup and prosthetics and everything for different characters. And say like the difficulty in moving, with one character versus, say, it being easier to move with another character. And he was also talking about how when it came to certain scenes, like say a montage scene of Steve, fighting various, alien opponents, basically, the costuming department and, they were limited in terms of, say, what they could come up with, for the fighters. And so he was talking about how, for the montage scene, they mixed and matched, various parts of different, costumes, to sort of give the illusion that Steve was fighting, multiple, alien opponents, not at the same time, but just like as a montage, or like a Rocky montage, right? But he was talking about how, basically, that was him in playing different opponents. But if you look real carefully, you can see how, they kind of look the same because they're borrowing, parts from, different costumes, but they sort of just kind of blend together at one point. But he said, though, basically just, he didn't just do, he didn't just physically, play the, aliens or alien fighters or the monsters, but, he actually helped out with some of the makeup and stuff. And so it's like, he was talking about how, if you worked on an Empire Pictures movie, you didn't just do one thing, you did several things. But he definitely had a blast, working on the movie, and it was cool, listening to him go down memory lane. So it's nice to see when someone was passionate about what they did back in the day, and they have good memories for it. So this was a good interview. Let's see, what else? Okay, you got your theatrical trailer, image galleries, and you have this reversible sleeve that shows the original artwork. So now I remember seeing this like in advertisements back in the day, like this particular picture. But for the Blu-ray releases of Empire Screams, they have this newly commissioned artwork for the movies, for the covers. And personally, I think this cover art is much better. So, yeah, there you go. But yeah, that was Arena. 4 out of 5 stars. This was a cool movie, and yeah, I enjoyed it. So if you made it this far, thank you very much for sticking around, and thank you very much for taking the time to check out my review. And you got any questions, comments, please drop a line and let me know. And if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. So y'all take care. Have a good night. Bye.